In the summer of 2003, three boys vanished from their tents during an overnight wilderness camp in Idaho's Salmon-Challis National Forest. No struggle, no footprints. Their tent was zipped shut from the inside, and the campfire was still burning. The only clue: a melted flashlight and a drawing scratched into a tree showing 4 stick figures, not 3. 20 years later, a hiker finds a rusted hunting knife in a bear cache. It has a name carved into the handle: one of the missing boys. But the carving is dated 2 years after the search was called off. What really happened at Granite Creek Camp? If you're into cinematic true crime stories based on real-life disappearances and cold cases finally cracked, subscribe now and tap the bell icon. July 11, 2003. Location: Granite Creek Camp, Idaho, 22 miles east of Yellow Pine. The wind whispered low through the pine trees that night, stirring the ashes around the glowing campfire. No one was awake to hear it. Granite Creek Camp sat in a clearing that hadn't seen a full moon in weeks. The forest had swallowed the stars. A dozen nylon tents dotted the tree line in a semicircle around the fire pit, each labeled in Sharpie with cabin numbers and first names. By midnight, only Tent 4 still glowed faintly from within. The boys inside, Caleb, Mason, and Elijah, ages 10 to 11, had been the last ones to sleep. They had stayed up passing around a flashlight, whispering about mountain lions and ranger ghost stories. The flashlight clicked off at 12:17 a.m., according to the burned-out bulb found days later. No one heard anything after that. Not the counselor sleeping 20 yards away. Not the 4 boys in Tent 3 who woke with their shoes still on. And not the wildlife cameras set up by the U.S. Forest Service, which had mysteriously glitched between 12:20 and 12:40 a.m. At 7:03 a.m., the head counselor, Andrea Shipley, made her morning rounds. She noticed the smoke still curling from the boys' fire pit, something that would have been doused before bed. Their tent was zipped shut from the inside. She called their names. No answer. When she unzipped it, the tent was empty. 3 sleeping bags, all unrolled. 1 shoe left behind. The boys were gone. There were no drag marks, no signs of a scuffle, no fresh prints in the dirt. But on a tree 20 yards into the woods, scratched with a stone, was a crude drawing. 4 stick figures. One of them was upside down. September 3rd, 2023. Location: Salmon-Challis National Forest, Granite Creek region. The sun had barely crested the ridge when Ethan Cordell stopped walking. His boots ground against the gravel-packed trail, shoulders rising with a slow breath as he stared at the rust-streaked metal of the bear cache in front of him. He hadn't come out here to find anything. He was just supposed to clear the old trails. Do a pass-through before the winter runoff turned this part of the Granite Creek region into a washout. But the cache was wrong. It wasn't even supposed to be here. There hadn't been a documented wildlife container in this quadrant since the fires in 2009. This one was half swallowed by undergrowth, charred brush, fallen pine limbs, and the kind of thick silence that blankets parts of the forest people don't walk anymore. Ethan stepped forward, brushing away the branches. The lid of the container creaked open, brittle from age and rust. Inside, scraps of canvas, torn zippers, a warped aluminum mess tin with ash inside, and a knife. Wood-handled, heavy, fixed blade. The kind a hunter might carry, except this wasn't hunting territory. Ethan picked it up carefully, wiping away flakes of corrosion with the edge of his glove. The initials EH were burned into the side of the grip, but below them, something else caught his eye. Hand-carved, crude, but legible. 2005, still here. He froze, because EH, Elijah Hartman, was one of the 3 boys who vanished from Granite Creek Camp in 2003. He would have been 10, and the knife was dated 2 years after the entire search had been shut down. Later that day, inside the ranger station 40 miles south in Stanley, Ethan laid the knife down on a folded towel atop a steel evidence table. He didn't say much, just stared at the words again, half whispering as if they were sacred. Still here. Across the room, Avery Quinn stepped forward, adjusting the sleeves of her field jacket. She was a forensic investigator with the Idaho Department of Public Safety, brought in to assist with cold case infrastructure. Just 2 weeks earlier, she'd been reviewing the digitized file on the Granite Creek disappearances, for archival purposes, or so she thought. Now the file had burst open like a long-sealed wound. "This is real?" she asked quietly. "You're sure it's not a forgery?" Ethan shook his head. "Found it in an unlogged wildlife cache. No prints, but the wood's aged consistent with a minimum of 15, maybe 20 years. Whoever carved that didn't just do it. They did it then." Avery leaned in. The knife felt like it radiated heat, like it had held in the breath of whoever last touched it. Her thoughts went to the original report. 3 boys, ages 10 to 11. No signs of struggle. Tent zipped from the inside. Campfire still burning. A 4th stick figure etched into a tree. That detail, the 4th figure, had always haunted her. She remembered reading the notes in the margins of the search logs. Possible miscount. Extra figure not in any rosters. No explanation. Now the implications twisted in her gut. She looked at Ethan. "What are the chances this got planted?" He didn't answer right away. "Almost 0, he said eventually. "The location's off-grid. You'd have to know the topography intimately to even reach that cache without GPS. And if this was a hoax, they'd have left more than one knife." Avery nodded. Her mind was already spinning toward protocol. She'd have to reopen the site, bring in ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and notify the original investigating agency. But another thought crept in, darker, colder. What if this wasn't a memorial? What if it was a message? The next morning, the site was flagged and sealed. Avery walked the trailhead at dawn, armed with the original camp's map and a high-resolution satellite overlay. The 2003 reports had been careful. The FBI had overseen the last 6 days of the search before it went cold. But there had always been gaps. According to the records, the search grid had extended 10 miles in every direction. What they hadn't accounted for was vertical coverage. The slope just north of the camp had been declared unsearchable after a rock slide 2 days into the investigation. And that's exactly where the cache was. She stared up the slope. Cold air pooled there, dragging through the trees like breath from something sleeping. The forest didn't make noise here. Not like it should. No insects, no wind, just static. It felt like the ground had been holding its breath for 2 decades. That evening, Avery sat alone in the ranger's cabin. She opened the old case file, now digitized but yellowing in her mind, and read it again. There were 3 names etched into the public memory. Caleb Thomas, 11. Mason Bell, 10. Elijah Hartman, 10. But there had always been one sentence in the report that no one could explain. Tree etching located 24.7 meters east of Tent 4 depicts 4 stick figures, 1 inverted. No 4th camper. No ranger saw anyone else. No one went missing that night except those 3, but the tree didn't lie. And neither did the knife. Avery leaned back in the chair, staring at the map pinned above the radio console. Her eyes drifted across the original search grid, and then to the northeast slope that had been dismissed in '03 as too unstable to reach. And that's when she saw it. A drainage cut, just barely visible. A thin scar on the topo line. A natural chute. And at the bottom of that chute, partially obscured by tree cover, was a structure. Not marked, not mapped. Avery's heart picked up pace. If it was what she thought it was, someone had built it after the boys vanished, or worse, long before. She stood, reached for her flashlight, and radioed Ethan. "Meet me back at the trailhead," she said. "Bring the dogs." September 4th, 2023. Location, Northeast Slope, 3.6 miles from Granite Creek Camp. The terrain was unforgiving. Ethan led the way, machete in hand, carving through underbrush thick with vine maple and black huckleberry. Above them, smoke-colored clouds hung low over the ridgeline like bruises pressed against the sky. The sun hadn't made it through since morning. Behind him, Avery adjusted the strap on her gear pack, eyes scanning every shift in the light between trees. The slope was steep, the ground uneven and damp. She didn't trust any of it. The dogs were already straining at the leash. There were two of them, cadaver-trained Belgian Malinois, Odin and Kiska. Both had been used on recovery ops across the Rockies. Both were reacting more than usual today. Whining, hackles up. Not aggressive, uneasy. They were picking up something, but not death. Something older, stranger. By 11:47 a.m., they reached the clearing. The forest peeled away just enough to reveal it. A narrow wooden structure, about 12 feet wide, partially sunken into the slope. The roof was camouflaged with branches and dirt, now half collapsed. The front door hung askew on a splintered hinge. It looked like a storm shelter, but wrong. Too deep, too remote, not built for weather. Jesus, Ethan muttered. Avery crouched beside the frame. Her gloved fingers brushed the rim of the threshold. The wood was weathered but solid. No sign of rot. It had been maintained, reinforced with crossbeams nailed into the soil, done professionally. She turned to Ethan. This isn't wilderness survival. Someone built this to stay hidden. Odin whined sharply and paced in circles. Ethan unslung the radio from his shoulder. Stanley Base, this is Unit 12. We've found an unmarked structure northeast of Granite Creek, requesting forensic backup and permission to proceed with interior entry. A crackle, then static. Then, Unit 12, confirm coordinates. Copy that. Entry permitted. Backup en route, ETA 2 hours. Avery nodded once. Let's go in. The air inside was colder than it should have been. Damp, stale, with the faint scent of rust and mildew. Ethan swept his flashlight left to right. The beam cut through shadows and dust, illuminating the interior. Bunk-style cot frames along the far wall. A metal table in the center. Molded food containers. An old lantern. And something in the corner. A stack of water-damaged drawings. Folded, scattered. Some rolled into tight tubes. Avery knelt, picked one up. Her breath caught. It was a child's drawing, crayon, faded. A rough sketch of a forest, and 3 stick figures standing around a campfire. One of them had a square drawn over the face, a black box. She opened another. This one showed 4 figures again, but now one was tied to a tree. A sun was drawn in the corner, smiling, but beneath it, in crude, scratchy pencil, "He made me watch." Avery stood, heart thudding. She opened the metal cabinet beside the table. Inside were 3 rolled sleeping bags, all identical, military green, folded tightly, but one was different, smaller, bright orange, a child's size. Tucked beside it, a pair of boys' shoes, water-damaged but intact. The soles were worn thin. Inside one shoe was a piece of paper, folded, stained. She unfolded it carefully. Just 3 words. I wasn't alone. Ethan stepped out of the far end of the shelter and called her over. There's a hatch. Trap door, maybe. Covered with slats and sealed from the top. Avery moved quickly. The dogs were growling now, not barking, just low and uncertain, as if sensing something beneath them. Ethan cleared the rest of the dirt from the trap door, pried it open with a pry bar. The air that escaped was different. Warmer, stale, and metallic. He dropped the flashlight in first. It illuminated a ladder descending into concrete, not wood. The shaft was reinforced, hand-built. This wasn't temporary. This was a chamber. Avery went first. She descended 10 rungs before her boots hit the floor. The space below was maybe 10 by 10 feet. Concrete walls. A drain in the middle of the floor. Metal loops bolted into the walls at ankle height. And in one corner, a rotting sleeping pad and a child's spiral notebook, half soaked through. She opened it. Most of the pages were unreadable, warped from water and age. But one page stood out, protected by a plastic ziplock. A name, written over and over and over. Elijah, 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 Elijah. And beneath that, scrawled in a rushed, uneven hand, "He kept calling me Mason." I'm not Mason. When Avery emerged back into the light, her face was pale. She looked at Ethan, voice quiet. "I don't think all 3 of them died that night." He frowned. "You think one of them survived?" She shook her head. "I think one of them was kept." September 5th, 2023. Location, Boise, Idaho. South Grove Rehabilitation Facility. The room smelled like lemon disinfectant and old linoleum. Andrea Shipley sat by the window, hands folded in her lap, eyes half-lidded. Her hair, once wild with curls, was pulled back into a wispy gray bun. Her wrists trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the tension that never quite left her. She had been 25 when it happened, the lead counselor at Granite Creek Camp in 2003. Now she was 61 and tucked away in a quiet, long-term care facility for what the staff described in her file as moderate functional dissociation, a polite phrase for a woman whose trauma never fully released her. Avery Quinn sat across from her, her tablet resting on her knee, the recorder already running. "Ms. Shipley," she began gently, "I'm reopening the Granite Creek case. Something was found near the old site. I'd like to ask you a few questions about that night." Andrea didn't speak, but her fingers twitched once, and her eyes lifted slowly, tracking Avery's face like someone surfacing from a deep, dark lake. Avery continued, "I want to understand what really happened that night. There were 3 boys in tent 4, but we found a drawing with 4. Andrea blinked. Her lips parted. A whisper, barely audible. "There were 4. Avery leaned in. "What do you mean?" But Andrea turned away toward the window. Her eyes followed something in the trees outside. Not a bird, not the sky. Memory. 20 years earlier, July 10th, 2003, 10:46 p.m., Granite Creek Camp. Tent check. Andrea zipped the flap of tent 6 closed and checked it off her clipboard. 2 more tents to go. The campfire was down to embers, still glowing gently in the center circle. She made a mental note to stir it out properly before bed. She reached tent 4. The boys inside were still awake. She could hear whispering, giggling, then shushing. "Elijah? Mason? Caleb?" she called softly. Muffled replies. "Yeah? Flashlight off, sleep time." "Okay." She crouched, zipped the flap an inch lower just to double-check. All 3 were in their bags. The flashlight beam flicked upward, caught Elijah's face for a second. Wide-eyed, alert. Mason was already fading into sleep, and Caleb gave her a thumbs up. Normal. She turned away and moved toward the last tent. But as she passed one of the pine trees near the edge of camp, the same tree later found with the drawing etched into its bark, she felt it, the feeling of being watched. She turned. The clearing was empty. Still. Present day, September the 5th, 2023. Andrea's breathing had changed. Shallow now, tight. Avery reached into her satchel and pulled out a printed photo, a scan of the knife handle found in the cache, the name Elijah visible. She set it gently on Andrea's lap. Andrea stared at it. Then her hands began to tremble violently. "Where?" she whispered. "Where did you find that?" "In a bear cache, 3 miles northeast of the original site. It was dated 2005. Andrea closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Avery leaned forward. "Andrea, did you ever see someone else near camp? Someone who didn't belong?" Andrea's voice cracked. "There was a boy. He wasn't on the roster. I saw him the morning before they vanished, standing at the edge of the woods. I thought he was part of another camp, but there was no other camp." Avery felt her pulse spike. "Did you tell anyone?" I asked the other counselors. They didn't see him. I told myself I imagined it, that I was tired, that I'd counted wrong." "Describe him." Andrea blinked. "He had dark hair, maybe 9, dirty clothes, just standing there, not afraid, just watching." Avery scribbled notes fast. "Did the boys mention him?" Andrea didn't answer at first. Then, that night, Elijah asked me a weird question. He said, "Is it okay if he stays in our tent too?" I thought he was joking, thought they were making up an imaginary friend. I laughed it off. She looked at Avery. Her eyes were wide, haunted. But now I think they let him in. Later that evening, Avery reviewed the transcript while sitting in her hotel room outside Boise. She played Andrea's voice back, slow, over and over. "Is it okay if he stays in our tent too?" If there had been a fourth child, it would explain everything. The fourth stick figure, the zip tent, the missing footprints. But that only raised more questions. Who was the fourth boy? Where did he come from? And why had Elijah carved "I'm not Mason" into a notebook 2 years later? Avery turned her tablet off and stared at the ceiling. Then she picked up the composite sketch of the unknown hiker reported in the area in 2006, a man seen by a forest guide 2 miles from Granite Creek. He'd been alone, dirty, said he was tracking deer but didn't carry a rifle. The guide reported him because something felt wrong. The man never gave a name, but the description: lean, dirty blonde hair, deep-set eyes, no gear, and about 20 years old. September 7th, 2023. Location: Northeast Slope. Recovered shelter site. The rain hadn't stopped in 16 hours. By the time Avery and the forensics team returned to the site, the slope was half mudslide. The dogs had to be tethered by safety harnesses to keep from slipping into the ravine below. But Avery didn't care. Not anymore. She wasn't chasing shadows now. She was chasing a timeline. A real one. Elijah's name carved on a knife dated 2 years after the disappearance. The fourth stick figure. A counselor who saw a boy no one else remembered. And a hidden chamber with someone's notebook screaming that their identity had been overwritten. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was a rewrite. A cover-up embedded in trauma. The forensic crew set up floodlights around the entrance to the structure. Water streamed down the slope like veins. Everything glistened with a wet sheen, making the wood shine like bone under skin. Ethan stood beside the trap door, now fully excavated. He had 2 techs working beneath him, a ground-penetrating radar unit and a structural analyst. "We picked up something irregular," he told Avery. "Beneath the concrete, about 2 feet down, center of the chamber, metal signature." Avery's mouth was dry. What kind of signature? Flat, rectangular, hollow. She knew what that meant. A box. The dogs were pacing again, Odin whining, Kiska pulling toward the hatch like she wanted in. Ethan handed Avery a pair of gloves and a mask. "We break it open together. You ready?" She nodded once. They dropped into the chamber. The floor felt different underfoot now. The scent of mildew was sharper. The walls still bore the faint smell of oil and damp concrete. The tech had already used a jackhammer to breach a square section of the floor, revealing a layer of compacted dirt below. They worked in tense silence for 20 minutes, trowels, brushes, gloved hands, until the corner of a metal box appeared. Avery wiped the surface clean. It was steel, heavy, roughly the size of a milk crate. The lid was bolted down on all four corners. No lock, no hinges, just sealed tight with rusted hardware. She pried one bolt loose, then another. And when she cracked it open, the smell hit her first. Copper. Decay. Old plastic. She pulled back the lid. Inside, a Polaroid camera, discolored but intact. A stack of photographs sealed in a Ziploc. A child's hooded sweatshirt, navy blue, size small. A plastic retainer case. And something wrapped in faded wax paper. She unfolded the paper. Inside was a child's molar, cracked at the root. Avery stood motionless. She could hear Ethan breathing behind her, heavy and slow. The silence felt like it had weight. "Get this to the lab," she said finally, her voice low. "All of it." Later that evening, back at the mobile field station, the photographs were digitized. Most were blurry, off-angle. Some appeared to be taken in near darkness, inside the chamber. Faces partly obscured, but a few were unmistakable. One showed a boy sitting on the floor against the wall. Dark hair, maybe 10 years old, eyes staring blankly at the lens. He looked exhausted. His shoes were missing. His wrist bore a bruise the shape of a leather strap. Another photo showed two boys, asleep side by side, wrapped in identical blankets. One of them, likely Mason, had a bandage on his chin. Then came the final photo, a shot of the shelter's interior, empty, no people. But drawn on the wall, in red marker, were 3 names, Elijah Mason, and beneath them, crudely crossed out, Caleb. "Why cross out Caleb?" Ethan asked quietly. Avery didn't answer at first. She zoomed in on the image, studying the handwriting. "It's like someone was keeping track," she said. "Inventory." Ethan frowned. "You think this was a holding site?" "No," she said. She looked up from the screen. "I think this was for conditioning. Someone was trying to reassign identities. Elijah says he's not Mason. Caleb's name is crossed out. Someone was replacing someone else." Ethan stepped back. That would explain the 4th figure. Avery nodded. "There weren't 4 kids here," she said. "There were 3 kids and 1 captor, a person who made one of them disappear and tried to make the others forget who they were." That night, back in the ranger cabin, Avery called the lab. The tooth had already been swabbed. She pulled the window open while she waited, breathing in the cold air like it could anchor her. The phone clicked. "Quinn," the lab tech said. "We ran the DNA from the molar. It's a match." "Which one?" Avery asked. "Elijah Hartman." Avery felt her heart stall. "But here's the thing," the tech added. "The tooth was lost naturally. Not pulled, not broken, and the estimated time of loss is around age 11. Avery blinked. "That means," she whispered. "Elijah was alive at least a year after the disappearance, maybe longer." The next morning, the dogs were back at the site. They hit on something farther up the slope, a depression under a tree root system. It took most of the day to dig. Inside, they found a bundle of clothing, a jacket, child-sized, and inside the pocket, a laminated camp ID badge. The name read, Caleb Thomas. The badge was split in half, like someone had deliberately snapped it. Avery turned to Ethan, her voice hushed. "Someone erased him. September 9th, 2023. Location, Yellow Pine, Idaho, rural outskirts, South Boundary Road." The tip came in just after 3 p.m. A woman named Mae Dunning, age 68, called the cold case tip line from a landline with a weak connection. Her voice was dry and tremulous, but clear. "I saw one of them. I think it was round 2005. He showed up barefoot on my porch. Wouldn't speak, wouldn't look me in the eye." Avery had her on speakerphone, sitting stiffly in the mobile unit, parked on the Forest Service Road. May continued. "He was maybe 11. Filthy. Clothes didn't fit. Stared at the trees more than he looked at me. Thought he was from some off-grid family at first. But he was scared of the dark. That part I remember. Avery's pulse kicked. She glanced at Ethan. Did he give a name? May hesitated. I tried. He didn't answer, but the only thing he said that whole hour was one sentence. Whispered it like it hurt to say, I'm not supposed to be Caleb. May's cabin sat on the edge of a clearing flanked by dense forest. An old A-frame structure with a warped siding and a woodpile stacked like ribs along the porch. Avery and Ethan arrived just after dusk. May was waiting in a rocking chair with a shotgun laid across her lap. Not threatening, just habitual. She was thin and wiry, with pale eyes that hadn't dulled a bit. I didn't call back then because I figured no one would believe me, she said as they approached. But when I saw that story on Channel 2, the knife, the shelter, I knew I had to say something. She led them into the cabin, where the scent of cedar and old coffee filled the air. I kept something, she said, from the boy. She handed Avery a small plastic bag. Inside was a strip of faded fabric, torn and fraying. The shoulder band from a Granite Creek Camp t-shirt. The logo barely visible through the grime. I found it near the woodpile after he ran off. Ran off? Ethan asked. May nodded slowly. I tried to keep him here. Gave him soup, a blanket. But just after sundown, he got spooked. Real bad. Kept looking at the tree line. Then he bolted out the back, fast, silent, like he'd done it before. Avery examined the fabric closely. The texture, the tears. It had been weathered but not staged. Authentic. May looked down at her hands. I think someone was looking for him, and I think he'd been trained not to speak. Back in the car, Avery sat still for a long time. The sentence repeated in her head like a drumbeat. I'm not supposed to be Caleb. It wasn't just confusion. It was instruction. Someone had drilled it into him, an identity not his own. A replacement. A script. And maybe the real Caleb was gone long before that. Which left a new question. If Elijah was alive in 2005, pretending to be someone else, then where had Mason gone? That night, Avery and Ethan sat in the mobile unit's back office going through the original 2003 behavioral reports. There had been one filed the day before the disappearance, an incident during fire building practice. According to the counselor's notes, Mason lashed out at Elijah, said he was copying him, called him a name thief. It was dismissed as teasing. But now it felt like a warning. Avery circled the phrase with a red pen. Maybe it wasn't teasing. Maybe Mason saw something before the rest. Ethan leaned over her shoulder. Like what? She hesitated, then spoke the thought neither of them wanted to admit. Maybe one of the boys had already been replaced. The next morning, Avery reached out to Dr. Eliza Vaughn, a trauma psychologist who specialized in long-term dissociative identity conditions in recovered kidnapping victims. Vaughn reviewed the notebook scan from the chamber, the repeated name Elijah, and the line, "He kept calling me Mason. I'm not Mason." Her analysis came quickly, quietly. This isn't memory loss, it's identity rejection. If the boy was forced to live under another child's name, especially following trauma, the repetition becomes a form of resistance, trying to reclaim selfhood. Avery exhaled slowly. Could someone do that? Force a child to become another? Dr. Vaughn's pause was long. Then, yes, it's a form of psychological erasure. Cults use it. Abusers use it. Break them down. Rebuild with a new name, new rules, new truth. In time, even the victim forgets where the mask ends and they begin. Later that day, Avery returned to the shelter with a forensics team from Boise. They had new equipment, thermal scanners, subterranean sonar. And what they found beneath the chamber made everyone stop breathing. A cavity, 8 feet by 10, hidden under a false concrete slab, reinforced with rebar. And inside, a crate of videotapes, each labeled with a date and a first name. The tapes were degraded, water damaged, but salvageable. And the first one they pulled, Mason, 9-02-2003. September 10th, 2023. Location, Boise, Idaho. DPS Digital Forensics Lab. The room was silent except for the mechanical hum of the playback equipment. Avery stood behind a two-way glass panel inside the Department of Public Safety's Digital Forensics Lab. Across the room, a technician threaded the degraded high-8 cassette tape into a specialized recovery deck. The screen was grainy, the image colorless and unstable. In the center of the monitor, a boy, maybe 10, lean, face bruised, eyes wide and vacant like floodlights in a power outage. He sat cross-legged on a concrete floor, back pressed to a wall, his fingers twitching in his lap. Mason Bell. The date in the bottom right corner of the screen flickered. September 2nd. 3 weeks after the disappearance. The image steadied just enough to show a narrow strip of the chamber's interior. A faint square of sunlight from a vent above. A metal dish on the floor. The edge of a sleeping pad. But what froze everyone in the room wasn't the boy. It was the voice. Deep, calm, deliberate. Male, not yelling, not growling, just speaking softly like a teacher. "Tell me your name again." The boy didn't answer. The voice came again, firmer. "We talked about this. Your name is Caleb. Say it back." The boy flinched, whispered, barely audible, "I'm Mason." A long silence followed. The sound of a chair scraping, footsteps shifting. Then the camera jostled, just slightly, and the voice said, "Wrong answer!" Avery turned away from the screen. Her jaw was clenched so tight her temples ached. She stared at the printout of the old camp roster on the table beside her. 3 boys, but only one was being spoken to. The next few minutes of footage were a blur of pacing, the boy crying silently, the camera repositioning again, and then cutting abruptly. The screen went black. Later that evening, Avery sat alone in the viewing room, surrounded by a dozen stills taken from the footage. In every frame, Mason's posture changed subtly. Shoulders lower, hands covering his chest, jaw tighter, but the one thing that remained the same, his eyes. They didn't blink much, just stared straight ahead. Alert, caged. The tech entered quietly and handed her a clipboard. "We've logged 6 tapes so far, all different dates. 3 with Mason, 2 labeled E, and 1 marked just with a symbol, a triangle inside a circle." Avery frowned. "Is it watchable?" "Barely. You'll want to see it." The mystery tape opened on static, then light. A flashlight beam jerking across a wall. The camera was handheld this time, no tripod. The perspective uneven. Then the lens turned toward the subject. A child again. This time not Mason, not Elijah either, but a boy with darker skin, shorter build. Shivering, no shirt. There was no date in the corner, no voice from behind the camera, just breathing. Then, faintly, a voice from off-screen, not the cameraman. "He's not one of them." The flashlight shifted again, revealing part of a hand-drawn grid on the wall. 5 names written in chalk. Caleb, Mason, Elijah. The last 2 were crossed out. Avery paused the tape. 5 names, 3 boys, 2 unknowns. Back at her temporary office in Stanley, Avery spread the evidence out across a folding table. The knife, dated 2005. The camp shirt scrap, found on Mae Dunning's porch, the ID badge, split in half. The notebook from the chamber. "I'm not Mason." And now, the videos, each piece had one thing in common: manipulation of identity. Avery picked up her notepad and wrote in the margin, what if he wasn't targeting 3 boys? What if he was cycling them? She stared at the photos of Mason, Caleb, and Elijah. And then the thought struck her like cold lightning. What if only one boy was ever meant to survive? That night, she called Dr. Vaughn again. "We have a working theory," she said. What if someone isolated multiple children with the intent to erase their identities, rebuild one under control, and discard the rest? Vaughn didn't hesitate. It fits a method known as selective imprinting. It's been used in unregulated conditioning experiments, paramilitary youth indoctrination. You isolate the subject, collapse their sense of self, and then train them to become someone else. When one accepts the role, you keep them. The others are erased. Avery felt the hair on her arms rise. So this wasn't random. It wasn't a crime of opportunity. No, Vaughn replied. It was programmatic. The next morning, as the forensics team prepared the last batch of recovered tapes, one of the analysts came in holding a sealed evidence pouch. "We ran chemical tests on the inside of the chamber wall," he said. "Found faint residues consistent with chloroform and something else." Avery looked up sharply. "What else?" The analyst's expression darkened. "Barbiturate compounds, sedatives, probably used to keep the kids passive between sessions." He placed a second bag on the table. Inside it, a rubber tubing strap, the kind used for mouth gags or feeding assistance. It was engraved. One word. Caleb, September 11th, 2023. Location, Idaho State Archives, Boise. The smell of the old file room was dust and stale paper. Bureaucracy turned to sediment. Avery moved slowly between the rows of beige cabinets inside the Idaho State Archives, pulling drawer after drawer of forgotten institutional records. She was looking for one program. Just one. And she finally found it in a rusted steel drawer labeled Section 9, Youth Rehabilitation Initiatives, 1996 to 2000. She slipped on gloves and drew out the manila folder. There it was. Clearwater Wilderness Behavioral Facility, Pilot Camp 7, an unlicensed youth behavioral wilderness program operating out of Salmon-Challis National Forest, disbanded after just 6 months in 1999 following allegations of improper restraint and undocumented disappearances. It had never made the news. No charges were filed, no names released, but one name kept showing up in the logs. Graham Keller. Position, field counselor. Background, former military, no psychology credentials. Terminated in 2000 following an internal dispute about methods deemed excessive and unsupervised contact with minors. Avery's pulse ticked louder in her ears. She pulled the personnel photo. There he was. Square jaw, deep-set eyes, graying temples even back then. Cold stare like stone. She had seen that face before. The composite sketch from the 2006 wildlife sighting. It wasn't identical. Older, more angular now. But the bones were the same. She turned over the back of the personnel photo and nearly dropped it. Scrawled in faded pen, Granite Creek subsector. Assigned June-July 2003, unofficial. By nightfall, Avery had a match in the DMV database. Graham R. Keller. Last registered address, a P.O. box in Darby, Montana, no listed residence. No vehicle currently registered, but someone had signed a lease under his name in 2002 for a fishing cabin just 14 miles from the Granite Creek trailhead. A location never checked in the original search perimeter. She called Ethan. "We have a name. We have a link to the region, and he was connected to a defunct youth behavioral program that operated with no oversight." Ethan's voice was sharp. "You think he's our captor? I think he was practicing a method. A script." She pulled up the cabin lease signature, a jagged cursive script, then overlaid it with the etching from the knife handle found in the bear cache. The letters were almost identical. September 12th, 2023. Location, Darby, Montana, U.S. Highway 93, backwoods property. The approach was quiet. 2 DPS agents, 1 federal liaison, and a local sheriff descended on the remote cabin under sealed warrant. The place had been empty for years. No utilities, no functioning locks. Inside, it looked like a bunker frozen in time. Duct-taped windows, mold along the edges of the walls. A camping cot collapsed in the corner, but under a loose floorboard in the bedroom, they found the proof. A stack of Granite Creek staff badges, all blank. A clipboard labeled Roll Conditioning Schedule, Subject C. And most damning of all, a faded camp photo from 2003. The counselors posed in front of the fire circle, all smiling. At the edge of the group, Graham Keller. His shirt had no name tag, and he wasn't on the official staff list. Back in Stanley, Avery laid the photo beside the current investigation board. One counselor had seen him. One had taken the boys' registration the morning of their arrival, but his name never appeared on any documentation, because he wasn't supposed to be there. He was embedded, like a ghost in the background of their first and last group photo. She checked local court records next, cross-referenced Keller's name, his alias variations, and the youth program's financial paperwork. That's when she found it. In 2004, a sealed juvenile guardianship filing from Lewis County. A boy, approximately 12 years old, placed under temporary foster care with an anonymous male guardian after being found without memory of origin. No school records, no social security number. Just a name. Caleb Thomas. Avery blinked. The real Caleb had been reported missing in 2003. So who was the boy given his name in 2004? She contacted the clerk's office under Emergency Investigative Authority. They released a redacted copy of the file. The boy in the paperwork wasn't Caleb. He matched Elijah's school photos. Same mole on his cheek, same ears, same eyes. He had been living under the wrong name for 10 years. The real Caleb? Never found. The replacement, reprogrammed and reassigned, and whoever did it had planned it that way from the beginning. That evening, Avery stood in front of the timeline board. Mason had resisted. Caleb had been erased. Elijah had been reshaped. And now there was only one person left who might know exactly how Keller did it, and who helped him. But she had no idea where he was. Until her phone rang. It was a tip from a seasonal wilderness worker in northern Wyoming. He had just seen someone matching Keller's description, hiking alone near the Wind River Range. He had an old military pack and a knife strapped to his hip. September 14th, 2023. Location, Wind River Range, Wyoming. Teton Pass. Spur. The air at elevation bit sharp and fast. Avery stood at the edge of the clearing, knees aching from the 9-mile ascent, lungs burning beneath a Kevlar vest. Beside her, FBI Special Agent Leah Serrano scanned the ridge with a thermal scope while their ground team circled wide. They were hunting a ghost. But this ghost had a pattern. Graham Keller, former wilderness youth counselor, suspected orchestrator of the Granite Creek disappearance and the psychological reprogramming of 3 missing boys, had been spotted 2 days earlier by a park employee, alone, armed, heading west through the lower Wind River Basin. He'd claimed to be hunting elk, but he hadn't been carrying a rifle. At 3:12 p.m., the team hit the trailhead of a wildfire service route long since reclaimed by moss and disuse. Hidden at the edge of a rock slide was what looked like a vent pipe poking from the earth. Ethan pried it open and smelled air that didn't belong to the mountain. Underground. Again. Agent Serrano's team began clearing debris, exposing a rusted hatch door buried beneath camouflage netting and pine straw. Spray-painted on the inside, just visible after scraping back grime, were 4 characters. S2A. Avery squinted. "Shelter 2, she whispered. They entered carefully, clearing rooms one by one, but Keller wasn't there. What they found was worse. A new chamber, bigger, newer, reinforced with steel plates and foam-insulated walls. No mold, no dampness. It had been in use recently. 1 bunk bed, 1 folding desk, and 1 corner of the room that made Avery's blood go cold. A standing mirror, 7 feet tall, bolted to the floor, with fingerprints smeared across the glass in child-sized patterns. Beneath it, Scattered like dropped puzzle pieces were laminated flashcards. My name is so. Say, I am safe now. Practice response. Yes, sir. No, sir. The cards weren't old. They were weeks old. And beside them, a single photograph tacked to the wall with a nail. It was an old Granite Creek group photo. But two of the children's faces had been scratched out, violently, deeply, over and over. They moved deeper into the shelter. In the second room, Agent Serrano found a laptop inside a waterproof hard case. Avery powered it on. Password protected, but easily bypassed by Serrano's tech. Inside were dozens of folders, some blank, some corrupted. One folder stood out. Session log, subject A2. It contained notes, routines, language drills, corrections, all logged with precise timestamps. March 15, 2023, subject failed response to name prompt. Isolation ordered. March 22, 2023, eye contact withheld. Calming procedure enacted. Response neutral. The final log entry was only days old. September 4, 2023, subject responsive. Transition phase initiated. Deployment readiness, 63%. Avery felt sick. This wasn't just a killer. It was a programmer. And whoever subject A2 was, they were being groomed for release. Repackaged under a name that probably wasn't theirs. She stared at the photo again. The scratched-out faces. Was A2 one of them? Or the next in a long, unbroken chain? Back at the command post, the team uploaded the laptop data to FBI servers for immediate analysis. Serrano looked at Avery. We're no longer dealing with a single event, she said. This is a sequence. Avery nodded. Keller wasn't hiding. She pointed to the logs. He was building, repeating. That night, they found a trail camera half buried outside the vent pipe. The card inside held motion-triggered footage from only 4 nights ago. The final clip was a grainy black-and-white night vision video. Timestamp, September 10th, 11:41 p.m. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, face partially covered but tall, male, carrying a backpack and what looked like a rifle bag slung crossbody. But it wasn't Keller. It was someone younger, maybe late 20s. Someone who moved like they'd grown up off-grid, silent, calculated, watching the shelter, not guarding it. And then, just before the clip ended, he looked into the camera, eyes glowing with the flash, and raised one finger to his lips. Shh. The screen went black. Avery and Serrano reviewed it frame by frame. He's not Keller, Serrano said. Too young. Avery's mind raced. If Keller trained him, then we're not just chasing a predator, Serrano finished. We're chasing a student. The next morning, search dogs uncovered a fresh trail heading northwest, toward deeper wilderness. It was booted. Wide stride, military pattern. Keller might not be leading anymore, but the method? It was still alive, and it had a new disciple. September 15th, 2023. Location, Wind River Range, abandoned fire watch station, elevation 9,000 feet. The fire tower stood like a forgotten god above the trees, black silhouette against the morning sky, its observation deck sagging under the weight of age and snow. It hadn't been on any of the recent maps. Avery stared up at it, heart pounding in her throat. The U.S. Forest Service had decommissioned these towers decades ago, but the one on this ridge still bore signs of human use. A fresh drag mark across the stairs, boot tracks leading up in irregular intervals. And at the bottom of the staircase, partially buried under lichen and soil, was a single child's sneaker. Small, blue, Velcro strap broken. Avery knelt beside it, brushing dirt away with her gloved hand. Inside the tongue of the shoe, written in faded marker, M. Lang, 2023. She looked up at Ethan, whose jaw had gone slack. "That's a new name," he muttered. Avery stood, voice tight. "That's a current name." They entered the tower just after 10 a.m. The interior was stripped bare. No comms, no furniture, just the bones of a place once meant for watching flames. But in one corner, tucked behind an overturned cot, was a makeshift pallet made of canvas tarps and thermal blankets. Scattered beside it, a water canteen, crayons, a spiral notebook, a wrapper from a protein bar with a Montana sell-by date from 3 weeks ago. Avery picked up the notebook. The first few pages were drawings. Trees, a square building, stick figures holding hands. But one page was different. Written in large, uneven block letters. "He says I'm Mason. But I'm not Mason. My name is Miles." Ethan stepped backward, exhaling hard. "It's happening again." Avery turned the page. Another drawing. A child in a blue hoodie standing between two large trees. One tree had a black symbol carved into it, a triangle inside a circle, the same as the mark found on the old tape from Granite Creek. But the most chilling image was beneath it. A small figure chained to a post, mouth drawn as a jagged black line. Standing behind him, larger, towering, a man with no face. Serrano's voice crackled over the radio. "Satellite overlay confirms. The closest access trail was blocked by a rock slide last year. No one would have reached this place by accident. Whoever brought that kid here knew exactly where they were going." "Any sign of the child?" Avery asked. "Nothing yet, but the scent trail from the shoe heads west, toward the ravine." By mid-afternoon, the K-9 units had pushed into the basin below the tower. Odin gave the first alert. Near a cluster of boulders, beneath a half-collapsed camouflage tarp, they found a survival shelter made from mylar and netting. And inside, Miles Lang, age 9, alive. He was crouched low, shivering violently, arms locked around his knees. When they approached, he didn't run. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just whispered, "He said he'd come back if I tried to leave." Avery knelt beside him. "My name is Avery," she said gently. "We're here to take you home." Miles shook his head, eyes locked on the tree line. "He's not gone," he whispered. "He's watching. He said he made me from someone else." Back at the mobile medical station, Miles underwent preliminary trauma assessment. He didn't speak again for hours, but when the doctor gave him paper and markers, he drew. And what he drew made Avery's hands go cold. A series of faces, each one nearly identical. Same shape, same haircut, same clothes, but with different names under each. Mason, Elijah, Caleb, Miles, and one final drawing. A mirror, cracked down the center, with the words, "Which one am I?" The FBI issued an immediate regional alert for Graham Keller and the unidentified male seen in the shelter camera footage, now believed to be his protégé. The working theory was horrifying. The disciple had taken over the methodology, not just continuing it, perfecting it. And Miles, he was meant to be the next replacement. That night, Avery stared out the window of the field station, her reflection barely visible in the blackness. It wasn't just about the boys anymore. It was about the blueprint. Whoever this new man was, the one who raised a finger to the camera, the one who didn't need to shout or drag or strike, had learned how to make identities collapse silently. And now that he'd failed with Miles, he'd go looking for the next one. September 17th, 2023. Location, Helena, Montana. Private residence of Dylan Crane. He introduced himself as Dylan Crane, age 42, a former wilderness survivalist. Avery met him in his backyard, 20 miles outside Helena. He was lean and hollow-eyed, chain-smoking through nerves, and constantly glancing toward the edge of the tree line like he expected something to come out of it. He didn't waste time with small talk. "You're looking for Keller," he said. "I knew him." Avery stayed quiet. Crane leaned forward, voice low. "You don't understand what he was doing. Everyone thinks it was about power or abuse. It wasn't. It was a test, a structure. Keller believed you could break a child down to zero and build a new identity from the ash. Not just memory loss, total reconstruction. He called it project stripping. Avery's blood ran cold. Why children? Crane smiled, but it wasn't kind. Because children are elastic. You tell an adult their name isn't theirs, they laugh in your face. But a 10-year-old? Scared, isolated, drugged. You can rewrite them. You just have to get in early. Inside his house, Crane showed Avery a box of old documents, journals, maps, photocopied logs from a survivalist training network Keller had used in the late 90s. There were notes on compliance markers, personality fractures, and a hand-drawn structure labeled S3, Cascade Basin Trial Site. Below it, Mason, underlined twice. Avery's hands trembled as she picked up the page. This was planned, she whispered. Granite Creek wasn't the only one. Crane nodded. There were at least 3 shelters in Idaho alone, maybe more in Utah and Oregon. The kids didn't know. They were just shuffled. Keller never stayed long. He said it was safer to build replacements in stages. Test them, break them down, reassign roles. He paused. And if they resisted too much, he erased them. Later that day, Avery cross-referenced the coordinates on Crane's maps with missing persons cases from 1996 to 2006. The overlap was chilling. A 12-year-old boy named Sammy Gellert vanished from a church retreat in Bend, Oregon. Never found. A foster child, Malik Reyes, disappeared during a supervised camping trip near Salt Lake City. Case closed as a runaway. A girl, Ellie Barnes, last seen with her older brother near the Columbia River. Her brother returned. She didn't. He later described a man in the woods who told her she had to change names. None of the cases were ever linked. Until now, Avery stared at the map of shelters. Granite Creek was only the most refined version. The template. The others were drafts, failures, training grounds. And now Miles, the boy recovered from the fire tower, had confirmed what Crane said without even knowing it. They weren't teaching obedience, they were teaching replacement. That night, Agent Serrano called from the forensics unit. More files came back from the laptop in Shelter 2, she said, hidden in encrypted folders. Looks like Keller was documenting the results of each site. Avery closed her eyes. And? Serrano's voice was flat. There were 12 children. Over 10 years. Avery's breath hitched. How many confirmed deceased? Only 3. 5 are still listed as unaccounted for. And 4, Serrano hesitated, were fully reassigned, meaning they survived, but under names they didn't start with. In the file was one more image. A still frame from what appeared to be surveillance footage. Site S-3. It was blurry, but in the background, barely visible, was a new child. Face mostly obscured by shadow, hand resting on a door frame. Serrano had run facial structure estimates. It wasn't Miles. Not any of the boys from Granite Creek. It was someone else. A new subject. And the timestamp on the footage? 5 days ago. Avery stared at the screen. Keller may have gone underground, but his student hadn't, and he was still building. September 19th, 2023. Location, Deschutes National Forest, Oregon. Sector D5. They found it just after dawn. A rust-red shipping container buried beneath a camouflage tarp, deep in the pines of Sector D5, a part of the Deschutes wilderness so overgrown it hadn't seen a human footprint in years. The signal that led them there came from a drone scan, faint thermal residue, consistent with recent occupancy. Enough to trigger a silent approach. Avery and Serrano arrived with a tactical team just as the sun cut through the fog. The padlock was gone, the door slightly ajar. Inside, it smelled of metal and old sweat. And something else. Desperation. The container had been converted. Crude insulation panels stapled to the walls, a solar battery rig powered 2 LED strips, a water jug, a plastic toilet bucket, a makeshift cot, and in the far corner, a bolted mirror. Just like the one from Shelter 2. But this one was shattered. The center spider-webbed outward, not by accident, but by deliberate, furious impact, as if someone had finally rejected the reflection forced upon them. On a nearby shelf, Avery found a small duffel bag. Inside were a Granite Creek staff badge, forged 3 dog-eared children's books, each with names scribbled out on the cover, a laminated flashcard. Respond with, "Yes, I am Caleb." Her hand tightened around the card. Serrano looked over her shoulder. "You think this was the final phase?" Avery nodded. "This was the transition chamber. Whoever was here was being reshaped into Caleb." Near the mirror, they found a box of videotapes, 9 in total, each labeled not by name, but by symbol. Triangles, circles, slashes, encoded, hidden, denying identity even in documentation. Tape number 6 had a post-it attached, "Finalization, Subject C." They played it on a field unit deck. The footage was grainy, night vision, but what it showed chilled every breath in Avery's lungs. A boy, no older than 10, stood in front of the mirror, rocking slightly. His voice was flat, robotic. "My name is Caleb. My parents are dead. I was lost and he saved me. He gave me a name." In the background, off camera, a voice corrected, "Say it again, like you mean it this time." Avery turned it off. Her hands were shaking. The timestamp was from 2005, meaning the real Caleb, the boy who had vanished from Granite Creek, had not died in 2003. He had been taken, broken down, rewritten, but not as himself, as a future replacement. The boy in the video wasn't being taught to be Caleb. He was Caleb, being taught to be someone else. Later that day, a cadaver dog alerted to the far end of the clearing. Beneath a rotted mound of soil behind the container, they unearthed a tarp-wrapped skeleton, child-sized. DNA results would take days, but they already knew. It wasn't Caleb. It was the last failed subject, the one meant to replace him, the one Keller's disciple had erased when the conditioning failed. And now they were hunting for a boy who hadn't been seen in 18 years, but who might still be alive, living under a name that was never his. That night, Avery sat alone in the mobile unit, the mirror card still in her lap. "Respond with, 'Yes, I am Caleb.'" She whispered it aloud, then crossed it out with a Sharpie, and wrote one word above it, "Who?" September 23rd, 2023. Location, Fort Collins, Colorado. Private security compound. He went by the name Evan Miles now. Employed by a private security firm. Clean background, no red flags. Until Serrano ran a biometric comparison against the old Granite Creek photos. The ears, the jaw, a scar beneath the left eye, the same one Caleb had gotten from a branch during a group hike in 2003. The match was 96.2% conclusive. They had found him. Caleb Anders, the real one, had survived. But he didn't know it. Avery sat across from him in the interview room, palms flat on the table, heart thudding slow and deep. He didn't remember her. Didn't remember the fire circle. Didn't remember Mason or Elijah or the boy Keller had buried in the woods. But when she showed him the mirror card, his eyes twitched. Just once. Then, "I don't know what that is." Avery nodded slowly. "You don't have to know, but your life was taken from you. You were made into someone you're not." He stared at her, face unreadable. "I like who I am now." They showed him the tapes. Let him watch the boy with his voice, his posture, repeat a name that wasn't his. He watched in silence. Until the last tape. The one where Keller's disciple whispered to the boy off camera, "You'll be safer this way. No one can hurt you if you don't exist." Something cracked in him then. Not visible, but something in the breath he held. Later that night, he called them back in. Spoke 3 words. "I remember Mason." Then he broke. Simultaneously, in southern Wyoming, a tactical team moved on a remote cabin built into the cliffside. The man they found inside didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't flinch when they zip-tied his hands and dragged him out into the sunlight. He looked into the lens of the arresting agent's body cam and whispered, "I was just continuing the lesson." He wouldn't give them a name, but his DNA matched a sample from an unclaimed foster child registered in 2007 under the name Ben Thayer, another missing child from a wilderness program in Utah. He'd been one of Keller's first projects, not a student, a graduate, and then a replicator. Back in Fort Collins, Avery sat with Caleb. No cameras, no files, no FBI agents, just the 2 of them. He held a crayon drawing in his hands, one from Miles Lang, recovered from the fire tower. 4 stick figures around a fire. The words scrawled in a child's handwriting. "I miss them." He looked at her. Was I the lucky one? Avery didn't answer, because there was no answer. 6 weeks later, the FBI released a statement confirming the dismantling of a decades-long, unauthorized psychological conditioning experiment that had targeted children under the guise of wilderness rehabilitation programs. 3 shelters were discovered. 9 total victims confirmed, 4 still unaccounted for. But 1 had returned, and he would never be erased again. July 11th, 2024. Location, Granite Creek Camp, Idaho. 21 years later, it was quiet again. The kind of quiet that made sound itself feel intrusive. Birdsong, Pine Creek, wind. Avery stood at the edge of the same clearing she'd studied in photographs for over a year. The one where 3 boys once vanished without a sound. But today, it wasn't just a crime scene. It was a memorial. Beside her, Miles Lang, now 10, ran his hand along the carved bark of an old pine. The same one where someone had once scratched 4 stick figures, one of them upside down. Now, a brass plaque was mounted beneath it, in memory of Caleb Anders, Mason Price, and Elijah Carter. Taken, rewritten, never forgotten. July 11th, 2003. Behind them, agents, survivors, and family members had gathered quietly around a new circle of stones. 12 total, 1 for each child, found during the dismantling of Keller's network. Avery had arranged them in a ring, mirroring the original fire pit. But this time, the flame in the center was real, controlled, chosen. Miles lit the first candle. His hands shook, but he didn't flinch. Then he looked up at Avery and whispered the words she'd written with him the night before. "My name is Miles Lang. I am not anyone else. I remember who I am. I was found." His voice didn't tremble. This was the boy who had once sat in a broken mirror room and asked, "Which one am I?" Now he knew. Later, as twilight fell, Avery stood alone by the fire. Serrano approached from behind, boots crunching over pine needles. "You going to stay with the Bureau after this?" Avery shrugged. "I don't know. I think I need to breathe for a while." Serrano nodded, then handed her a small envelope. Inside was a photo. 4 boys, huddled around a campfire, grinning, messy-haired and wild-eyed. From before it all happened, before anyone forgot who they were. Avery recognized Caleb's gap-toothed smile, Mason's lopsided haircut, Elijah's buckled knees, and a 4th boy she didn't know. On the back, someone had written, "The real us." She folded the photo carefully and tucked it into her coat. Not into evidence, not into a file, but into memory, where it belonged. The fire burned late into the night, no longer a symbol of destruction, but of survival. Because even after identity is shattered, even after silence replaces a name, the fire remembers. And it keeps them warm.